All right, let's dive into something that is frankly one of the most frustrating things a parent can go through. I'm talking about that school investigation that just feels off, like it was designed to go absolutely nowhere. We're going to show you how to spot one of these sham investigations from a mile away.
I'm sure if you've ever had to report a serious issue at school, you've heard these four little words. We consider the matter resolved. Ah, it's the ultimate conversation ender, right? It's their way of saying, case closed, move along.
But what if it's not resolved? What if that neat little bow they tied on it is just for show? What if the whole investigation was never actually about finding out what happened, but was all about protecting the school? Now that is the really critical question we're going to dig into.
Okay, so to really get a handle on what this looks like in the real world, let's walk through a story, a case that shows you exactly how a so-called resolved issue can be anything but. So picture this, a sixth grader reports being threatened by 3 other students. They even named 2 witnesses who saw the whole thing. The parent does everything right, emails the principal with every single detail. A week goes by, and what's the school's response? Oh, it's resolved. It was all just joking around. But here's the thing, those key witnesses, they were never even interviewed. And get this, the person investigating was the same administrator who had already ignored earlier reports about these kids. The result of this resolved issue? 2 weeks later, the student was assaulted. This wasn't just some mistake, this was a total and honestly a predictable system failure.
You know, this kind of failure happens so often that there's actually a name for it. It's what happens when a so-called investigation stops being a search for the truth and becomes, well, just a way to manage liability.
And that brings us to the core idea here, investigative collapse. Now think of this as a diagnostic tool for parents. It's a framework, a way to pinpoint the exact procedural failures that prove an investigation wasn't real. It shows it was just a sham, a process designed from the get-go to reach a specific conclusion, not to actually find out what happened.
So you've got to be asking, why on earth would a school do this? Well, it really boils down to what we can call institutional incentives. I mean, think about it. If they find a staff member was at fault, that could create huge legal problems. They might be protecting their own people, trying to manage the school's reputation, or maybe they just don't have the time or training for a real investigation. A lot of the time, the easiest path, the path of least resistance, is to just find that nothing was wrong.
Okay, but here's where it gets really practical. How do you spot this happening as it's unfolding? Well, this framework gives us seven crystal clear red flags. We call them collapse triggers, and they are your signals that an investigation is probably a sham. That's right, 7. Keep that number in your head. This is your checklist. This is how you spot a fake.
First on the list, missing witnesses. The school might tell you, oh, we determined we had sufficient information, but what's really going on? They made a conscious choice not to talk to the very people who could back up the victim's story. This is not an oopsie, it's not an oversight, it's a deliberate choice to ignore evidence that doesn't fit their desired outcome.
All right, trigger number 2 is a huge one, conflict of interest. This is when the school puts someone in charge of the investigation who already has a personal stake in the outcome. You know, like putting the assistant principal who dropped the ball on previous reports in charge of this one. At that point, their investigation isn't about finding the truth, it's about proving they didn't mess up the first time.
Next up, trigger number 3, timeline violation. You'll hear the excuse, we're just conducting a very thorough investigation. But when weeks and weeks go by on a really serious threat, that's not being thorough, that's evasion. They're dragging their feet, and that delay lets evidence vanish, it lets memories get fuzzy, and it allows more harm to happen. And then you've got trigger number 4, evidence suppression. So the school says, sorry, no cameras in that hallway. Okay, fine. But what about those social media posts you showed them? Or the thick file of prior incident reports on the same kid? When an investigator refuses to even look at evidence that's right there in front of them, they're not investigating, they're actively suppressing the truth.
Trigger number 5 is a sneaky one. Classification manipulation. This is basically a word game. A credible threat of violence suddenly gets downgraded to just joking around. Serious harassment becomes a simple misunderstanding. Look, this isn't just about picking different words. It is a deliberate tactic to get out of mandatory discipline and to make a clear pattern of behavior just disappear from the record.
Okay, trigger number 6, retaliation indicators. This is critical. If, after you file a report, the bullying actually gets worse, or your kid is suddenly getting blamed for causing drama, that is a gigantic red flag. Retaliation proves the school failed to protect your child, but it's also something more. It's a separate civil rights violation all on its own.
And that brings us to the final trigger, number 7, the predetermined conclusion. This is when the school wraps everything up by saying, well, there was just insufficient evidence. But the truth is, they never even looked for any. The whole investigation was just a show, a piece of theater they had to perform to get to the conclusion they wanted all along, that the school did nothing wrong.
Okay, so you've spotted these triggers. Now what? This is the most important part. Documenting every single one of them is absolutely crucial, because when you identify an investigative collapse, you're building a bridge, a direct line from the school's sloppy procedure to real, actual legal consequences.
Let me show you exactly how this chain works. It all starts with you proving the investigation was flawed, that it was basically a sham.
And once you've done that, it's not just a bad investigation anymore. No, it creates what we've been talking about, an investigative collapse. And just being able to name it that way is incredibly powerful. Why is it powerful? Because here's the key legal connection. An investigation that is this broken is considered evidence of something called deliberate indifference. That's a legal term, and it basically means the school knew there was a risk to your kid, but their response was so completely unreasonable that it proved they just didn't care about your child's safety.
And that is the final piece of the puzzle. Proving deliberate indifference, that creates actual legal exposure for the school district. It turns their failed investigation into your most powerful tool for forcing accountability.
So, how do you fight back against this? Well, knowing the triggers is step 1. Taking action is step 2. Let's get into your action plan for how you can challenge a collapsing investigation while it's still happening.
Think of this as your playbook. You can't just report the problem and hope for the best. You have to manage the investigation. So right away, demand the investigation plan in writing. You provide them with the detailed witness list. Don't ever assume they'll find them on their own. If you spot a conflict of interest, you object to it in writing. You track the timeline with precision, and you cite the policy violations when they delay. And when it's all resolved, you request a list of every single piece of evidence they reviewed. If their conclusion makes no sense based on the evidence, you challenge it. And of course, you document every single act of retaliation as its own separate violation. See, every one of these steps creates a paper trail, and that paper trail makes a sham investigation almost impossible for them to defend.
And so, we're going to end right back where we started, with a single question. But the difference is, now you have the tools to actually answer it. The next time a school official looks you in the eye and tells you a matter is resolved, you can step back, look at the whole process, and ask yourself the one question that truly matters. Was the school investigating the harm done to my child, or were they just investigating their own liability? The answer to that question, well, that's going to tell you everything you need to know.